Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, and here every whisper hides a mystery. These Miss Marple stories are my own creations, written just for you. So lean in and let the clues begin. In the sleepy village of Limstock, a web of poison pen letters spreads lies, tearing neighbors apart. When a suicide turns to murder and a young maid meets a brutal end, Miss Jane Marple steps in, her sharp eyes piercing the shadows of deceit. As secrets unravel, a cunning killer lurks, hiding behind typed words and a locked shed. Can she unmask the truth before the village crumbles? The moving finger writes, and the truth will out. Chapter 1. The Arrival in Limstock. The train from London chugged through the verdant Devon countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing counterpoint to the patchwork of fields and hedgerows flashing past the window. Miss Jane Marple, a slight, elderly lady with a gentle smile and eyes that missed nothing, sat quietly in her compartment, her hands folded neatly over a small traveling case. She had accepted an invitation from her old friend, the Reverend Leonard Clement, to spend a few weeks in the village of Limstock, a prescription of sorts for her recent bout of bronchitis. The doctor had recommended fresh air, and Miss Marple, ever practical, saw no reason to decline a chance to visit a place she had not seen in years. Limstock was as charming as she remembered, its cobblestone high street lined with thatched cottages, their gardens bursting with late summer roses. The vicarage, a rambling Georgian house with ivy creeping up its walls, stood at the edge of the village, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. Mary Clement, the Reverend's wife, greeted Miss Marple with a flurry of warmth, her auburn hair slightly askew as she ushered her guest into the parlor. "Jane, how good of you to come," she exclaimed, pressing a cup of tea into Miss Marple's hands. "You'll find Limstock dreadfully quiet, I'm afraid, but it's just what you need." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her pale blue eyes taking in the room's modest furnishings, the chintz curtains, the worn but polished oak table, and the faint scent of lavender from a bowl of potpourri. The Reverend, a tall man with a kind face and a perpetually distracted air, joined them, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he spoke of parish matters. "It's a peaceful place," he said, "though we've had a bit of a stir lately." Mary shot him a glance, her lips tightening, but he continued, oblivious. "Letters, you know, anonymous ones, quite unpleasant." Miss Marple's delicate eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Anonymous letters?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with curiosity. Mary hesitated, then reached for a drawer in the sideboard, producing a folded sheet of cheap paper. The words, typed in uneven block capitals, were crude and accusatory, suggesting an improper relationship between the Clements. "It's nonsense, of course," Mary said, her cheeks flushing as she tossed the letter onto the table. "Someone's idea of a cruel joke." The letter lay there, its stark black ink a jarring contrast to the vicarage's homely warmth. Miss Marple leaned forward, her fingers brushing the paper as if to gauge its weight. "How very distressing," she murmured, though her mind was already at work, cataloging the letter's tone, its deliberate anonymity. She had seen such things before, in her own village of St. Mary Mead, spiteful missives that stirred distrust and sowed discord. They were rarely mere pranks. "Have others received them?" she asked, her tone as mild as if she were inquiring about the weather. Mary nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "Half the village, it seems. The baker, the doctor's wife, even old Mr. Pie at the grocery. It's got everyone on edge." The Reverend frowned, his earlier cheer dimmed. "It's the uncertainty, you see, not knowing who's behind it, makes people look at their neighbors differently." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the window, where the village green lay bathed in golden light. Limstock, for all its picturesque charm, harbored a shadow, and she sensed it was deeper than mere gossip. That evening, as they dined on Mary's simple but hearty shepherd's pie, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the village's inhabitants. She learned of Richard Symington, the solicitor, and his nervous wife, Mona, who rarely left their grand house on the hill. There was Joanna Burton, a spirited young woman renting a cottage nearby, and Elsie Holland, the Symingtons' governess, whose beauty had set tongues wagging. The village, Miss Marple noted, was a small canvas, its characters vividly drawn, each with their secrets and vanities. As she retired to her room, the letter's words lingered in her mind, not for their content, but for what they concealed. She opened her knitting bag, her fingers finding the familiar comfort of her needles, and smiled faintly. Limstock, she suspected, would prove far less quiet than her hosts imagined. Chapter 2. The letters spread. The late summer sun cast long shadows across Limstock's high street, gilding the cobblestones and lending a deceptive glow to the village's tranquil facade. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the vicarage's bay window, watched the comings and goings of the villagers with the quiet attentiveness of a naturalist observing a rare species. Her knitting lay in her lap, a soft tangle of pale blue wool, but her needles were still, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The poison pen letter received by the Clements had been the topic of hushed conversation at breakfast, and Miss Marple sensed it was but the first thread in a larger, more sinister tapestry. Mary Clement, bustling about with a tray of scones and a fresh pot of tea, wore the strained cheerfulness of someone determined to ignore an unpleasant truth. "It's just a prank, Jane, don't you think?" she said, setting the tray on the table. "Some idle mind with too much time on their hands." Her voice held a note of forced brightness, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. The Reverend, engrossed in a parish ledger, murmured agreement without looking up. Miss Marple smiled gently, her expression as mild as the morning light, but her thoughts were far from idle. Pranks, in her experience, were rarely so calculated, nor so widely aimed. The vicarage's front door creaked open, and Joanna Burton breezed in, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she tossed her scarf onto a chair. A modern young woman with a penchant for bright lipstick and tailored trousers, Joanna had taken a cottage in Limstock to escape London's clamor. She was, Miss Marple noted, the sort of person who drew attention without seeking it, her quick wit and easy charm, a contrast to the village's more reserved inhabitants. "Good morning, all," Joanna called, helping herself to a scone. "I hear I've missed the latest village drama. Another letter, was it?" Mary's smile faltered, but she nodded. "Yes, and it's dreadful. I wish they'd stop." Joanna raised an eyebrow, her green eyes sparkling with curiosity. "They? You think it's more than one person?" Miss Marple, stirring her tea, noted the question's sharpness. Joanna, for all her flippancy, was no fool. "One person, I should think," Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost lost in the clink of china. "But with a purpose, perhaps." Joanna shot her a glance, intrigued, but Mary quickly changed the subject to the upcoming church fete, her words tumbling over one another in her haste to avoid the topic. By noon, the village was abuzz with fresh news. The poison pen letters had multiplied overnight, like mushrooms after rain. Miss Marple, accompanying Mary on a walk to the post office, overheard snatches of conversation as they passed the butcher's shop and the tea room. Mrs. Dane, the doctor's wife, had received a letter accusing her of an affair with a traveling salesman. A claim so absurd it provoked nervous laughter among the shopkeepers. Mr. Pye, the grocer, was said to have been targeted with an accusation of watering down his milk, a charge that sent his customers into a flurry of indignation. Even Miss Ginch, the prim schoolmistress, had not escaped, her letter hinting at improper conduct with a pupil's father. The village, Miss Marple observed, was like a pond disturbed by a stone, its surface rippling with unease. At the post office, a cramped space smelling of ink and wax, Mrs. Baker, the postmistress, was in her element, doling out gossip as freely as she stamped letters. "It's a scandal, Mrs. Clement," she said, leaning over the counter, her eyes wide with relish. "4 letters this morning alone. I saw them myself, typed, not handwritten, mind you. Same cheap paper, same ugly words." Miss Marple, pretending to examine a display of postcards, listened intently. Typed, she thought, her mind filing away the detail. A typewriter was not a common possession in a village like Limstock, and its use suggested a degree of deliberation that belied Mary's theory of a prank. "Who do you think could be behind it, Mrs. Baker?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as innocent as a child's. The postmistress puffed up, eager to share her theories. "Could be anyone, Miss Marple. There's that Mrs. Cleet, the one who fancies herself a witch, always muttering about curses. Or maybe young Tommy Price, Mrs. Price's boy. He's got a sly look about him. Mind you, I wouldn't put it past old Mr. Pye himself, stirring up trouble to boost his shop's custom." She laughed, but the sound was brittle, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of fear in her eyes. Fear, she knew, was the true poison of these letters, spreading distrust where once there had been community. As they left the post office, Miss Marple paused to adjust her shawl, her eyes scanning the high street. Across the way, she saw Richard Symington, the solicitor, striding toward his office, his face set in a frown. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed with the air of someone accustomed to authority. Beside him walked Elsie Holland, the governess to his 2 young sons, her blonde hair gleaming under a wide-brimmed hat. They made a striking pair, and Miss Marple noted the way Elsie's hand brushed Symington's arm as they spoke, a gesture too familiar for mere employer and employee. "A handsome couple," she remarked to Mary, who snorted. "Handsome, perhaps, but Mona Symington doesn't think so. She's been poorly lately, shut up in that big house of theirs. Elsie's a bit too fond of the limelight, if you ask me." Mary's tone was sharp, and Miss Marple filed away the comment, sensing the undercurrents of village rivalries. Mona Symington, she recalled from the previous evening's conversation, was a nervous, retiring woman overshadowed by her husband's prominence. The dynamics of the Symington household, Miss Marple suspected, might hold a key to the unfolding mystery. That afternoon, Mrs. Price, the village's unofficial matriarch, hosted a tea party at her imposing manor house, its rose gardens a riot of color against the gray stone walls. The gathering was a microcosm of Limstock society. Mrs. Dane, her face pale but composed, Mr. Pye fussing over his teacup, Miss Ginch sitting stiffly in a corner, and Joanna Burton, who arrived late with a breezy apology and a new silk scarf. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth with her knitting, was content to listen, her presence almost unnoticed amid the chatter. The topic, inevitably, turned to the letters. "It's an outrage," Mrs. Price declared, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. "Someone with a grudge, mark my words, they want to tear this village apart." Her eyes swept the room, as if daring anyone to confess. Mrs. Dane, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigor, murmured, "It's all lies, of course. I've never even met a salesman." Her laugh was forced, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands clenched the saucer. Mr. Pye, adjusting his spectacles, ventured that the letters were a sign of moral decay, earning a nod from Miss Ginch, who added, "The culprit must be found and punished." Joanna, lounging on a sofa, offered a different view. "It's someone bored, I bet. Nothing else to do in this sleepy place but stir up trouble." Her tone was light, but her eyes darted to Miss Marple, as if seeking her reaction. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking rhythmically. "Boredom can be dangerous," she said, her voice so soft it was nearly drowned by the clink of teaspoons. "But I wonder if it's not something more deliberate." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling like dust. As the tea party dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, accepting Mrs. Price's offer to show her the garden. The older woman, her back ramrod straight, led the way through rows of dahlias and delphiniums, her pride in her flowers evident. "You've seen this sort of thing before, haven't you, Miss Marple?" she asked abruptly, pausing to snip a wilted bloom. "In that village of yours, what's it called? St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Oh, yes. Villages are much the same, Mrs. Price. People's natures don't change, only their methods." Mrs. Price's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more, and Miss Marple sensed she was being weighed, assessed. Back at the vicarage, as twilight softened the sky, Miss Marple sat with Mary and the Reverend, the conversation returning to the letters. The Reverend, his earlier distraction replaced by unease, admitted that the parish felt fractured, its trust eroded. "It's as if we're all suspects," he said, rubbing his temples. Mary, clearing the tea things, added, "I saw Mrs. Dane whispering with Miss Ginch today. They've never been close before. These letters are making friends of enemies, and enemies of friends." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the day's observations. The letters were not random, she was certain. Their targets, respected figures like the doctor's wife, the grocer, the schoolmistress, suggested a calculated intent to disrupt the village's social order. The use of a typewriter, as Mrs. Baker had noted, pointed to someone with access to such a machine, perhaps someone educated or professional. Richard Symington's face flashed in her mind, his frown as he walked with Elsie Holland, but she pushed the thought aside. It was too early for conclusions, though not for suspicions. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple stood by her window, looking out at the darkened village. Limstock's charm was undeniable, but beneath its surface lay currents of envy, resentment, and perhaps something darker. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a similar spate of anonymous letters had once masked a far graver crime. Her fingers traced the edge of her knitting bag, the familiar shape of her needles grounding her thoughts. The poison pen letters were a symptom, she decided, not the disease. Somewhere in Limstock, someone was weaving a web, and Miss Marple intended to unravel it, thread by careful thread. Chapter 3. A Tragic Turn. The morning mist hung low over Limstock, shrouding the village in a silvery veil that softened the outlines of its thatched roofs and ancient hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the vicarage's breakfast table, sipped her tea with her usual composure, though her sharp eyes noted the strain etched into Mary Clement's face. The poison pen letters, which had multiplied like a plague across the village, had cast a pall over the vicarage's usual warmth. The Reverend Leonard Clement, his spectacles fogged from the steam of his porridge, attempted a cheerful remark about the church fate, but his words fell flat, drowned by the unspoken tension that lingered like an unwelcome guest. Mary, clearing the dishes with more force than necessary, broke the silence. "It's getting worse, Jane," she said, her voice tight. "Another letter arrived at the Dane household yesterday, and poor Miss Ginch was in tears at the post office. I don't know how much more this village can take." Miss Marple nodded, her expression as serene as ever. But her mind was alert, piecing together the fragments of gossip and observation she had gathered since her arrival. The letters, she suspected, were not merely spiteful outbursts, but part of a larger, more sinister pattern, though its shape remained elusive. Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the vicarage door interrupted them. Joanna Burton, her auburn hair slightly disheveled and her cheeks flushed from the morning chill, burst in without ceremony. "Have you heard?" she said, her green eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and horror. "Mona Symington is dead, found this morning in her drawing room. They're saying it's suicide." Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while the Reverend's spoon clattered against his bowl. Miss Marple's knitting, resting on the table, remained untouched, but her gaze sharpened, fixing on Joanna with quiet intensity. "Suicide?" Miss Marple repeated softly, her tone inviting more details. Joanna nodded, sinking into a chair. "That's what Dr. Dane says. She was found with a bottle of cyanide beside her and one of those wretched letters on the table. It accused her of, well, something unspeakable with Dr. Dane himself. Absolute rot, of course, but they say it pushed her over the edge." Mary's eyes filled with tears, and she murmured, "Poor Mona. She was always so fragile." Miss Marple, however, noted the word "they" in Joanna's account. Village gossip, she knew, was a swift and unreliable messenger, often obscuring truth with its haste. Determined to see the scene for herself, Miss Marple suggested a visit to the Symington household to offer condolences, a proposal Mary accepted with reluctant duty. The walk to the solicitor's grand house on the hill was brisk, the mist parting to reveal Limstock's rolling fields and the distant spire of the church. The Symington residence, a handsome Georgian structure with tall windows and manicured lawns, seemed oddly silent as they approached, its grandeur at odds with the tragedy within. The door was opened by Elsie Holland, the governess, her striking features pale but composed. "Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "It's kind of you to come. Mr. Symington is distraught." They were led into the drawing room, where Mona Symington's body had been found only hours earlier. The room was elegant, with heavy damask curtains and a polished mahogany table, but a faint, acrid scent lingered, sharp and unmistakable. Miss Marple's eyes swept the scene, noting the pristine state of Mona's silk dress, laid out on a chair as if for inspection, and the untouched tea tray on a sideboard, its cups gleaming in the dim light. A single sheet of paper, typed in the now familiar block capitals, lay discarded near the fireplace, its words accusing Mona of infidelity. The cyanide bottle, small and innocuous, stood on the table, its label stark against the polished wood. Richard Symington entered, his face a mask of grief, though Miss Marple observed the careful precision of his movements, as if he were an actor playing a role. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady despite the redness in his eyes. Mona was not herself lately. These letters, they preyed on her mind. He gestured to the paper, his hand trembling slightly, and Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flickered to Elsie, who stood silently by the door. She was so sensitive, he added, almost as an afterthought. Miss Marple murmured condolences, her tone gentle, but her questions were precise, probing Mona's habits, her mood, her visitors in the days before her death. Richard's answers were vague, his irritation barely concealed, and Miss Marple filed away his discomfort for later reflection. As they left the drawing room, Miss Marple paused to admire a vase of late roses, using the moment to study the room further. The fireplace was cold, its ashes undisturbed, and a faint mark on the carpet near the table caught her eye. A smudge, as if something had been dragged. She said nothing, but her mind catalogued the detail, alongside the scent of almonds that clung to the air, sharper than it should have been for a single dose of cyanide. Elsie Holland, escorting them out, mentioned that Mona had been alone the previous evening, a fact Richard confirmed with a nod. She liked her solitude, he said, but Miss Marple detected a note of rehearsal in his words. Back at the vicarage, the news of Mona's death spread like wildfire, carried by the postmistress, Mrs. Baker, who had already heard every detail from the milkman. The village gathered in knots along the high street, their whispers a mix of shock and speculation. Miss Marple, walking with Joanna Burton to the tea-room for a late lunch, listened as the younger woman dissected the tragedy. "It's awful, of course," Joanna said, her tone more curious than mournful. "But Mona was always a bit off, wasn't she? Always fussing, always nervous. I suppose the letter was the last straw." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. "Perhaps," she said, "but I wonder if the letter was the cause, or merely the excuse." The tea-room, a cozy establishment run by a bustling widow named Mrs. Tuttle, was crowded with villagers seeking solace in gossip. Mrs. Price, the manor's matriarch, held court at a corner table, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. "It's those letters," she declared, her eyes flashing. "They drove her to it. Whoever's writing them has blood on their hands." Mrs. Dane, seated nearby, looked pale, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "It's monstrous," she whispered. "Mona was a good woman, whatever anyone says." Miss Ginch, her lips pursed, added, "This village is cursed. First the letters, now this." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the undercurrents of fear and accusation, each villager's reaction revealing more than their words. Joanna, stirring sugar into her tea, leaned toward Miss Marple. "What do you make of it, Miss Marple? Suicide? Or something else?" Her voice was low, her eyes bright with interest. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the room's chatter. "Suicide is a convenient explanation," she said, her tone mild. "But convenience is not always truth. The letter, the cyanide, the timing, they suggest a certain deliberation." Joanna's eyebrows lifted, but before she could press further, Mrs. Tuttle approached with a fresh pot, her face grim. "They say the police are coming," she confided. "Inspector Graves from the county. About time, if you ask me." That evening, as the vicarage settled into a somber quiet, Miss Marple joined Mary and the Reverend in the parlor, where a fire crackled against the gathering dusk. The conversation turned to Mona Symington, her reclusive nature, and her strained marriage. "She was never happy," Mary said, her voice heavy with pity. "Richard was always so busy, and those boys of theirs, Colin and Brian, they're sweet, but a handful. Elsie Holland does her best, but she's no mother." The Reverend nodded, his face troubled. "I visited them last week," he said. "Mona seemed distracted, but I thought it was just her nerves. If only I'd seen." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple patted his hand, her touch light but reassuring. Alone in her room later, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched as she gazed at the darkened village. The scent of cyanide, the pristine dress, the smudge on the carpet. These details gnawed at her, refusing to align with the narrative of suicide. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman's death had been staged to look self-inflicted, the truth buried beneath layers of misdirection. Mona Symington, she suspected, had not chosen death, but had it thrust upon her. The poison pen letter a cruel prop in a larger scheme. The question was not only who, but why, and Miss Marple's mind, sharp as her knitting needles, began to trace the threads of motive and opportunity. The arrival of Inspector Graves the next morning brought a new energy to Limstock, his brisk efficiency a contrast to the village's lethargy. A sturdy man with a clipped mustache and a no-nonsense manner, he called at the vicarage to gather statements, his notebook filled with precise, angular handwriting. "A sad business," he said, accepting a cup of tea from Mary. "The coroner's leaning toward suicide, but I'll need to speak to everyone who knew Mrs. Symington. These letters, any idea who's behind them?" Mary shook her head, but Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, offered a gentle observation. "The letters are typed, Inspector," she said, her voice soft. "That might narrow your search. Not many in Limstock own a typewriter." Graves glanced at her, his expression a mix of surprise and skepticism, but he jotted down the detail. "Worth checking," he said gruffly, though Miss Marple sensed he underestimated her. As he left to interview Richard Symington, she returned to her knitting, her mind turning over the morning's revelations. The letters, the death, the uneasy dynamics of the Symington household. They were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. Limstock, for all its charm, was hiding a secret, and she would not rest until it was laid bare. Chapter 4. The Village Unravels. The September sun broke through the morning mist, bathing Limstock in a golden glow that did little to dispel the chill of unease that had settled over the village. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's garden with a cup of tea and her knitting, observed the world with her customary quiet alertness. The roses, heavy with dew, nodded in the gentle breeze, but the village's usual rhythm was disrupted, its inhabitants moving with the cautious tread of those who no longer trusted their neighbors. Mona Symington's death, officially deemed a suicide, had deepened the shadow cast by the poison pen letters, and Miss Marple sensed that the truth lay buried beneath layers of carefully crafted deception. Mary Clement emerged from the vicarage, her apron dusted with flour from a morning spent baking. "Jane, you'll catch a chill out here," she said, though her voice lacked its usual warmth, her eyes darting toward the high street where villagers hurried past, their heads bowed in whispered conversation. "The village is in a state," she added, sinking onto a bench beside Miss Marple. "Mrs. Dane was at the butcher's this morning, looking like she hadn't slept, and Mr. Pye's been telling everyone the letters are a judgment on Limstock's sins." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her face serene, but her mind cataloging every detail. "People do talk," she murmured, "but talk often hides more than it reveals." The letters had not ceased with Mona's death. If anything, their frequency had increased, each one typed on the same cheap paper, the same uneven block capitals, accusing respected villagers of imagined sins. The baker, Mr. Cuttle, received one claiming he'd shortchanged his customers. The postman, young Tommy Price, was accused of tampering with mail. Even Mrs. Price, the manor's formidable matriarch, found a letter slipped under her door, hinting at a scandal involving her late husband. The village, once a haven of neighborly trust, was unraveling, its seams frayed by suspicion and fear. Miss Marple, determined to understand the scope of the poison pen campaign, suggested a walk to the village shop, a pretext to observe Limstock's mood. Mary agreed, eager for distraction, and they set off down the winding lane, the air crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. The high street was quieter than usual, its usual bustle replaced by furtive glances and hushed voices. At the shop, Mr. Pye, a wiry man with a penchant for dramatic gestures, was holding court behind the counter, his spectacles glinting as he recounted the latest letter's contents to a cluster of customers. "It's a disgrace," he declared, waving a tin of biscuits for emphasis. "Someone's out to ruin us all." Miss Marple, browsing a display of tinned peaches, listened intently as Mrs. Baker, the postmistress, joined the conversation, her voice sharp with indignation. "I handled 3 more letters this morning," she said, her hands busy sorting parcels. "All typed, same as before. I told Inspector Graves it's someone with a typewriter, but he's too busy poking around the Symington house to listen." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. The postmistress's observation, though delivered with the air of a woman reveling in gossip, was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Typewriters were not common in Limstock, and their use suggested a perpetrator with access to one, perhaps someone in a professional or administrative role. As they left the shop, Miss Marple paused to adjust her shawl, her eyes catching sight of Joanna Burton crossing the street, her stride purposeful, despite the heavy basket she carried. Joanna, renting a cottage near the church, had become a frequent companion, her modern outlook a refreshing contrast to the village's insularity. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Clement," she called, waving them over. "You've heard about the latest letters, I presume? The whole place is positively humming with it." Her tone was light, but her green eyes held a spark of curiosity, as if she sensed there was more to the story than village gossip. They fell into step together, Joanna's chatter filling the silence as they walked toward the tea room. "I saw Richard Symington this morning," she said, lowering her voice. "He was coming out of his office, looking like he hadn't slept in days. And Elsie Holland was with him, all solicitous, carrying his briefcase like some devoted secretary. It's odd, don't you think? Mona barely in her grave, and they're thick as thieves." Mary's lips tightened, but she said nothing, her disapproval evident. Miss Marple, however, noted the observation with interest. Joanna's sharp eye for human behavior was proving useful, and her comment about Symington's office sparked a memory of the typewriter Mrs. Baker had mentioned. At the tea room, Mrs. Tuttle greeted them with a tray of scones and a fresh pot of tea, her face lined with worry. "It's a terrible business," she said, setting the table with a clatter. "First poor Mona, now these letters getting worse. I had one myself yesterday, accusing me of watering down the milk in my cakes. As if I'd do such a thing." Her indignation was genuine, but Miss Marple noted the way. Her hands shook as she poured the tea, a sign that the letters were taking a toll even on the stout-hearted widow. The conversation turned to Mona's death, the village's collective shock giving way to speculation. "They say she was fragile," Joanna said, spreading jam on a scone. "But I only met her once, at Mrs. Price's last tea party. She seemed nervous, always glancing at Richard, as if waiting for his approval. I can't imagine her taking her own life, though." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression bland but her mind racing. "People are often more complex than they appear," she said softly, "and appearances can be arranged." Joanna shot her a quick glance, intrigued, but Mrs. Tuttle's arrival with a plate of biscuits forestalled further questions. As they left the tea room, Miss Marple suggested a detour past the Symington house, ostensibly to admire the late roses in its garden. The real purpose, however, was to observe the household's dynamics firsthand. The grand Georgian facade loomed against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Elsie Holland was in the garden, pruning a bush with more enthusiasm than skill, her blonde hair tied back with a scarf. She greeted them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's kind of you to stop by," she said, her voice carefully polite. "Mr. Symington is at his office, but the boys are inside. It's been difficult for them." Miss Marple, expressing sympathy, asked after the boys' well-being, her questions gentle but probing. Elsie's answers were vague, her attention drifting toward the house, and Miss Marple noted the nervous way she gripped the pruning shears. "Mona was so fond of her garden," Miss Marple remarked, her eyes sweeping the neat beds. "Did she spend much time here in her final days?" Elsie hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really. She was indoors a lot. Tired, I think." The answer was too quick, and Miss Marple's smile hid her growing suspicion. Something in the Symington household was amiss, and Elsie, she sensed, knew more than she let on. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple joined Mary and the Reverend for supper, a simple meal of roast chicken and vegetables that did little to lift the mood. The conversation turned to the letters, and the Reverend, usually mild-mannered, expressed rare frustration. "It's tearing the parish apart," he said, his fork poised over his plate. "I saw Mrs. Dane and Miss Ginch whispering in church yesterday, and Mr. Pye refused to shake hands with the baker. It's as if we're all strangers now." Mary nodded, her eyes shadowed. "I heard Mrs. Price is organizing a meeting to discuss it. She wants the village to take a stand, demand answers from Inspector Graves." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking as she worked on a half-finished scarf. The letters, she reflected, were a tool, designed to sow discord and distract from something deeper. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where anonymous letters had masked a calculated crime, their venom a smokescreen for motive. The typewriter was a key, she decided, its presence narrowing the field of suspects. Richard Symington, with his solicitor's office and access to such a machine, loomed large in her thoughts, But she needed more than intuition to unravel the truth. That evening, as the vicarage settled into a quiet hush, Miss Marple took a turn around the garden, the cool air sharpening her senses. The village lay still under a blanket of stars, its beauty marred by the invisible poison spreading through its heart. She thought of Mona's death, the cyanide, the pristine dress, the letter, and the questions that refused to settle. Why had Mona been targeted? What had she known or seen that made her a threat? And why were the letters continuing, their accusations growing bolder with each passing day? As she re-entered the vicarage, Miss Marple paused at the hall table, where a stack of parish newsletters lay beside a typewriter used for church correspondence. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, noting their worn edges, and smiled faintly. The machine was old, its typeface distinct, and she wondered if it matched the letters' stark capitals. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would pay a visit to Richard Symington's office, under the guise of a minor legal query. The threads of the mystery were beginning to weave together, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to follow them to their source. Chapter 5. The Solicitor's Household. The autumn light filtered through the vicarage's leaded windows, casting a soft glow over the breakfast table where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting resting beside a cup of cooling tea. The village of Limstock, still reeling from Mona Symington's death and the relentless tide of poison pen letters, seemed to hold its breath, its charm tarnished by suspicion. Miss Marple, her pale blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles, listened as Mary Clement recounted the latest gossip. Another letter had reached the vicarage, this one accusing the Reverend of misusing church funds. "It's absurd," Mary said, her voice trembling with indignation as she crumpled the paper. "But it's wearing us down, Jane. The whole village feels it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression as serene as the morning mist outside, but her mind was a whirl of connections. The letters, typed with deliberate malice, were not mere pranks, but a calculated campaign. And Mona's death, though officially a suicide, bore the hallmarks of something darker. The solicitor's household, with its strained dynamics and whispered scandals, drew her attention like a magnet. She resolved to visit the Symington residence, ostensibly to offer further condolences, but with the intent to observe its inhabitants closely. The opportunity came that afternoon, when Mary received an invitation to dine at the Symington house, extended by Elsie Holland, the governess, who cited Richard Symington's desire for company in his grief. "You must come too, Jane," Mary insisted, her face pale but determined. "It's the least we can do for poor Mr. Symington." Miss Marple agreed, her gentle smile masking the keen interest that stirred within her. The Symington household, she suspected, held secrets that the village's gossip only hinted at, and she intended to unravel them with her quiet, unobtrusive probing. The walk to the Symington residence was brisk, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. The house loomed at the top of the hill, its Georgian elegance a stark contrast to the turmoil within. Elsie Holland greeted them at the door, her statuesque figure clad in a simple but well-cut dress, her blonde hair swept into a neat chignon. "Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but tinged with strain. "Thank you for coming. It's been a difficult time." Her blue eyes, though striking, held a flicker of unease, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands smoothed her skirt, a nervous gesture disguised as composure. The drawing room, where Mona's body had been found, was immaculate, its heavy curtains drawn back to admit the fading light. The faint scent of cyanide was gone, replaced by the fragrance of polished wood and fresh flowers. But Miss Marple's memory lingered on the scene she had observed days earlier. The pristine dress, the untouched tea tray, the smudge on the carpet. Richard Symington entered, his tall frame slightly stooped, his face etched with the lines of a man bearing a heavy burden. "You're very kind to come," he said, shaking hands with a practiced ease that belied his red-rimmed eyes. Mona would have appreciated it. The dinner table was set with care, the silver gleaming under the chandelier's soft glow. The Symington boys, Colin and Brian, aged 10 and 8, sat stiffly in their chairs, their eyes darting to their father with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Elsie Holland, seated beside them, fussed over their plates, her maternal air at odds with her youth. Miss Marple, placed opposite Richard, engaged him in gentle conversation, her questions as delicate as the lace napkin in her lap. "You must find it hard, Mr. Symington," she said, "managing such a large household alone. Did Mona take an active role in its affairs?" Richard's fork paused midway to his mouth, and he cleared his throat. "Mona was delicate," he said, his voice measured. "She left much of the household to Elsie, who's been a godsend with the boys." Elsie flushed, her smile tight, and Miss Marple noted the glance that passed between them, brief but charged. "Mrs. Symington was fortunate to have such help," she said, her tone mild. "And you, Miss Holland, must find the boys a handful. Do they keep you busy?" Elsie nodded, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Oh, yes, they're lively, but good boys. Mona was kind to them. Always, though she wasn't, well, very strong." The conversation turned to village matters, and Miss Marple steered it toward the poison pen letters, watching Richard's reaction closely. "Such a distressing business," she said, her eyes soft but piercing. "Have you received any yourself, Mr. Symington?" He stiffened, his hand tightening on his glass of sherry. "One or two," he admitted, "but I pay them no mind. Idle nonsense." His dismissal was too quick, and Miss Marple's needles, tucked into her bag, seemed to click in her mind, marking the moment for later reflection. As the meal progressed, Miss Marple observed the boys, their subdued manner a stark contrast to the boisterousness one might expect from children their age. Colin, the elder, picked at his food, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Brian cast furtive glances at Elsie, as if seeking reassurance. "Do the boys spend much time in the garden?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "It's such a lovely space." Elsie hesitated, then nodded. "They play there sometimes, though Richard, Mr. Symington, likes to keep the garden tidy. He's particular about it." Richard's smile was strained, and Miss Marple noted his quick glance toward the window, where the garden lay shrouded in dusk. After dinner, as the group retired to the drawing room, Miss Marple excused herself to freshen up, taking the opportunity to explore the house's lower floor. The hallway was lined with family portraits, their stern faces staring down in silent judgment. A door to the study stood ajar, and she slipped inside, her movements as quiet as a shadow. The room was orderly, its desk dominated by a typewriter, its keys worn but functional. She bent closer, noting the typeface, and her lips curved in a faint smile. It was an imperial, the same model she'd seen in the vicarage, and its letters matched the stark capitals of the poison pen missives. A coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. Returning to the drawing room, she found Richard pouring sherry, his movements precise, but his eyes distant. Elsie was reading to the boys, her voice soothing, though Brian's head rested heavily on her shoulder, his eyelids drooping. Miss Marple, settling into a chair, complimented the garden again, her eyes drifting to the shed, visible through the window, its door secured with a heavy padlock. "Do you tend the garden yourself, Mr. Symington?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a child's. He nodded, a touch too quickly. "I enjoy it. Keeps me occupied." His voice was flat, and Miss Marple's smile hid her growing certainty that the shed held more than gardening tools. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple lingered by the door, her eyes catching a photograph on the mantel. Mona, pale and unsmiling, standing beside Richard, whose arm rested possessively on her shoulder. The image, taken in happier times, spoke of a marriage strained by more than Mona's nerves. Mary, waiting in the hall, whispered, "It's a sad house, Jane. Those boys, they need a mother, not a governess." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts elsewhere. The Symington household, with its polished surfaces and hidden tensions, was a microcosm of Limstock's unraveling, and she suspected Richard was at its heart. The walk back to the vicarage was silent, the night air heavy with the promise of rain. Mary, lost in thought, said little, but Miss Marple's mind was alive with possibilities. The typewriter, the shed, Richard's guarded demeanor, they were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to discern. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a seemingly innocuous detail, a misplaced key, had unlocked a murder. The poison pen letters, she was certain, were a distraction, their venom masking a deeper crime. Mona's death, staged as suicide, bore the marks of careful planning, and Richard's role, though not yet clear, was central. Back at the vicarage, as Mary and the Reverend retired, Miss Marple sat by the parlor fire, her knitting untouched. The letters, she mused, served a dual purpose, to sow discord and to divert attention. But from what? Mona's wealth, perhaps inherited from a maiden aunt and controlled by Richard, was a possible motive. Or perhaps Elsie Holland, with her youthful beauty and proximity to the solicitor, played a larger role than she let on. The boys, too, were a factor, their subdued behavior suggesting they had witnessed something, perhaps not the act itself, but its prelude. As the fire dwindled, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the shed. Richard's glance toward it, his insistence on its tidiness, hinted at something hidden, perhaps the cyanide used to kill Mona, or evidence of his involvement in the letters. She resolved to speak with Joanna Burton, whose cottage overlooked the Symington garden, and to enlist Inspector Graves's aid in examining the typewriter. The truth, she knew, lay in the details, and Miss Marple was adept at finding them, her gentle manner a shield for her relentless curiosity. The clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the quiet vicarage. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and made her way to her room. Limstock, with its picturesque lanes and shadowed secrets, was a puzzle she was determined to solve. The poison pen letters were but the surface, and beneath them lay a truth as cold and sharp as the cyanide that had ended Mona Symington's life. With a final glance at the darkened village, Miss Marple closed her curtains, her mind already weaving the next steps in her quiet, unyielding pursuit of justice. Chapter 6. A Second Death. The autumn chill had settled over Limstock, wrapping the village in a damp embrace that seemed to mirror its growing disquiet. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's cozy parlor, worked on her knitting with a steady rhythm, her needles clicking like a metronome against the backdrop of a crackling fire. The poison pen letters, relentless in their spread, had frayed the village's nerves, and Mona Symington's death, though officially ruled a suicide, lingered in the air like an unresolved chord. Miss Marple, her pale blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles, sensed that the tragedy was not an ending, but a prelude, the first act in a drama yet to unfold. Mary Clement, bustling in with a tray of tea and biscuits, wore a strained expression, her usual warmth dimmed by the weight of recent events. "It's too much, Jane," she said, setting the tray down with a clatter. Another letter arrived at the post office this morning, accusing Mrs. Tuttle of selling stale cakes, as if she'd do such a thing. The Reverend, engrossed in a sermon draft, looked up, his face etched with worry. "The parish is unraveling," he said quietly. "I saw Mr. Pye arguing with the baker yesterday, and Mrs. Dane hasn't been to church since her letter arrived. It's as if trust has vanished." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert, cataloging the village's fractures and the clues they might conceal. The morning's calm was shattered by a frantic knock at the vicarage door. Mrs. Baker, the postmistress, stood on the threshold, her face ashen and her hands wringing her apron. "It's terrible, Mrs. Clement," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Agnes Waddle, the Symingtons' maid, is dead, found in their kitchen this morning, her head bashed in. And there was another of those wretched letters beside her." Mary's hand flew to her mouth, and the Reverend rose, his sermon forgotten. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Dear me," she said softly, "how very shocking. May we see the scene, Mrs. Baker? It might help to offer comfort." Mrs. Baker, eager for company in her distress, led them to the Symington house, her breathless narrative filling the crisp air. "It was the milkman who found her," she said, her words tumbling over one another. "He went round to the back door, as usual, and there she was, sprawled on the floor. The letter accused her of spying on her employers. Such nonsense. Poor girl, only 16, and now this." Miss Marple listened, her face a mask of gentle concern, but her mind was racing. A second death, so soon after Mona's, was no coincidence, and the presence of another poison pen letter suggested a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The Symington residence, its Georgian facade looming against the gray sky, seemed to exude a quiet menace as they approached. The back door leading to the kitchen stood ajar, guarded by a young constable whose face was pale with inexperience. Inside, the kitchen was a scene of stark contrast. The gleaming copper pots and tidy counters juxtaposed with Agnes Waddle's crumpled form on the tiled floor, a pool of blood staining the stone. The poison pen letter, typed in the familiar block capitals, lay clutched in her hand, its words accusing her of eavesdropping on the Symingtons' private affairs. Miss Marple, stepping carefully to avoid disturbing the scene, noted the unlatched window above the sink and the faint scuff marks on the floor, as if something heavy had been moved. Inspector Graves, summoned from the county, arrived shortly after, his clipped mustache and brisk manner a reassuring presence amid the chaos. "A clear case of murder," he declared, surveying the scene with a practiced eye. "Likely a vagrant, slipped in through the window and panicked when the girls saw him. We'll have the area searched." Miss Marple, standing quietly by the door, tilted her head, her expression bland. "Perhaps," she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made Graves glance at her. "But the window is rather high, Inspector, and the latch is stiff. It might be worth considering who else had access to the kitchen." Graves raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to such observations from an elderly spinster, but he made a note in his pocketbook. Mary, clinging to Miss Marple's arm, whispered, "It's too awful, Jane." First Mona, now Agnes. "What's happening to Limstock?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her gaze lingering on the letter in Agnes's hand. The typed words, crude and venomous, were a hallmark of the campaign that had gripped the village, but their placement here, in the wake of a violent death, suggested a purpose beyond mere malice. Agnes, she suspected, had known something, perhaps about Mona's death. That made her a threat. As they left the kitchen, Miss Marple paused to speak with Elsie Holland, who stood in the hallway, her face pale but composed. The governess's hands twisted a handkerchief, and her eyes darted toward the kitchen door. "It's dreadful," she said, her voice low. "Agnes was such a quiet girl, always doing her work. I can't imagine why anyone would—" Her words trailed off, and Miss Marple, her tone gentle, asked, "Did Agnes seem troubled lately, Miss Holland? Perhaps she mentioned something about Mrs. Symington's death." Elsie shook her head. Too quickly, Miss Marple thought. No, nothing. She was just upset, like we all were. The conversation was interrupted by Richard Symington's arrival, his face a mask of shock as he strode into the hall. "What's this about Agnes?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Inspector Graves explained the situation, and Richard's shoulders slumped, though Miss Marple noted the way. His eyes avoided the kitchen. "This is a nightmare," he said, running a hand through his hair. "First Mona, now this. I don't know what's happening." His grief seemed genuine, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the fleeting glance he cast at Elsie, a look that spoke of shared secrets rather than employer-employee formality. Back at the vicarage, the news of Agnes's death spread like wildfire, carried by Mrs. Baker's breathless account to anyone who would listen. The village gathered in knots along the high street, their whispers a mix of horror and speculation. Miss Marple, joining Joanna Burton for a walk to the tea room, listened as the younger woman dissected the tragedy. "It's ghastly," Joanna said, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she adjusted her scarf. "Agnes was just a maid, barely more than a child. Why would anyone kill her? And that letter, do you think it's the same person behind all of them?" Miss Marple's needles, tucked into her bag, seemed to click in her mind as she considered the question. "I think," she said softly, "that the letters are a tool, Miss Burton. They distract, they accuse, but they also conceal." The tea room was crowded, its air thick with the scent of scones and the hum of anxious conversation. Mrs. Tuttle, bustling behind the counter, greeted them with a grim nod. "It's a dark day for Limstock," she said, pouring tea with a trembling hand. "First Mrs. Symington, now poor Agnes. I told Inspector Graves it's no vagrant. Someone in this village is to blame." Mrs. Price, seated at a corner table, overheard and nodded vigorously. "It's a vendetta," she declared, her voice carrying over the room. "Someone with a grudge against the Symingtons. Mark my words." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression bland but her mind cataloging every word, every glance. Joanna, stirring sugar into her tea, leaned toward Miss Marple. "You don't think it's a vagrant, do you?" she asked, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "You think it's someone closer to home?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "I think," she said, that Agnes's death was no accident. She may have seen or heard something that made her dangerous. The letter in her hand was meant to explain her death, just as the letter beside Mona was meant to explain hers. Joanna's eyebrows lifted, but before she could press further, Mrs. Tuttle approached with a fresh pot, her face lined with worry. That evening, Miss Marple joined Mary and the Reverend for supper, the mood somber despite the comforting aroma of roasted lamb. The conversation turned to Agnes, and Mary, her eyes red from crying, shared a troubling detail. "I saw Agnes at the market last week," she said, her voice low. "She was nervous, kept looking over her shoulder. When I asked if she was all right, she said she'd seen something odd the night Mrs. Symington died, but she wouldn't say more. I thought it was just her imagination." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the revelation. Agnes, she realized, had been a witness to something crucial, and her death was the price of her knowledge. Alone in her room. Later, Miss Marple sat by the window, the darkened village stretching before her like a chessboard. The letters, the deaths, the Symington household, they were pieces in a game, and she was beginning to see the moves. Richard Symington, with his typewriter and his guarded demeanor, was a likely player, but his motive remained unclear. Was it Mona's wealth, controlled by her trust? Or was Elsie Holland, with her beauty and proximity, more than a bystander? The shed, locked and unremarked, loomed in her thoughts, a potential repository for evidence the police had yet to uncover. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a maid's untimely death had unmasked a murderer hiding behind a facade of respectability. Agnes's murder, staged to look like a random attack, bore similar hallmarks. The letter a crude attempt to tie it to the broader campaign. Miss Marple resolved to speak with Inspector Graves to urge a closer look at the Symington household, particularly the shed and the typewriter. She also planned to enlist Joanna's aid, her cottage's view of the garden offering a vantage point for observation. The truth, she knew, lay in the details. The unlatched window, the scuff marks, the letter's precise placement. And Miss Marple was determined to find it, her quiet persistence a match for the village's darkest secrets. As the clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the vicarage, Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand. Limstock, with its picturesque lanes and hidden malice, was a puzzle she would not abandon. The poison pen letters were a smokescreen, and Agnes's death was a warning, but Miss Marple was undeterred. With a final glance at the starlit village, she closed her curtains, her mind already plotting the next move in her quiet, relentless pursuit of justice. Chapter 7. The Typewriter Clue. The autumn wind swept through Limstock, rustling the leaves that carpeted the village lanes and lending a restless edge to the air. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's parlor with her knitting, gazed out at the gray sky, her pale blue eyes as sharp as ever behind her spectacles. The village, already shaken by Mona Symington's death and the poison pen letters, was now reeling from the murder of Agnes Waddle, the Symingtons' young maid. The brutality of the act, coupled with the typed letter found clutched in her hand, had deepened the village's unease, turning neighbor against neighbor. Miss Marple, however, saw beyond the surface panic, her mind weaving connections between the letters, the deaths, and the secrets of the Symington household. Mary Clement, bustling in with a tray of tea, wore a pinched expression, her usual cheer eroded by the weight of recent events. "It's too much, Jane," she said, setting the tray down with a clatter. First Mona, now Agnes. The village is falling apart, and these letters keep coming. Mrs. Price got another this morning, accusing her of bribing the church warden. It's madness. The reverend, poring over a parish register, looked up, his face drawn. I fear for the souls of this parish, he said quietly. This malice is tearing us asunder. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. The letters, she was certain, were not random, but a carefully orchestrated campaign, and Agnes's death was no isolated tragedy. Inspector Graves, the county policeman with a clipped mustache and a no-nonsense air, arrived at the vicarage shortly after breakfast, his notebook in hand and his brow furrowed. "I'm at my wit's end, Mrs. Clement," he admitted, accepting a cup of tea. "The Waddle girl's murder points to a vagrant, but the letter complicates things. It's the same typewriter as the others, no doubt about it." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, tilted her head, her voice soft but deliberate. "The typewriter, Inspector, is indeed significant. Mrs. Baker mentioned it's an uncommon machine in Limstock. Have you considered whose offices or homes might have one?" Graves glanced at her, his skepticism tempered by a grudging respect. "We've checked the post office and the vicarage. Both have typewriters, but neither matches the letter's typeface. I'm heading to Symington's office next. He's got one, I hear." Miss Marple nodded, her smile faint but encouraging. "A wise choice, Inspector, and perhaps you might look at the shed in his garden. It's locked, I understand, but locks can hide many things." Graves made a note, his pen scratching against the paper, and Miss Marple sensed he was beginning to value her insights, however unconventional they seemed. Determined to pursue her own inquiries, Miss Marple proposed a visit to Richard Symington's office, under the pretext of seeking legal advice about a fictional inheritance. Mary, eager for distraction, agreed to accompany her, and they set off down the high street, the wind tugging at their hats. The solicitor's office, a modest brick building with a polished brass plaque, stood at the edge of the village, its windows overlooking the green. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of ink and leather-bound books, and a young clerk, flustered by their arrival, ushered them into Symington's private office. Richard Symington rose from his desk, his tall frame impeccable in a tailored suit, though his eyes were shadowed with fatigue. "Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with strain. "How kind of you to call. I trust this isn't about recent events?" His smile was forced, and Miss Marple noted the way. His hands fidgeted with a pen, betraying his unease. She launched into her fabricated tale of a distant cousin's will, her tone vague and slightly flustered, the perfect picture of an elderly spinster out of her depth. As Symington explained legal procedures, her eyes wandered to the typewriter on a side table, its keys worn but functional, its imperial brand unmistakable. "Such a useful machine," she remarked, gesturing toward the typewriter. "Do you use it often, Mr. Symington?" He glanced at it, his expression tightening. "Occasionally," he said. "The clerk handles most of the typing, but it's available to anyone in the office. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with innocent curiosity. "Oh, just an old woman's fancy. I've always been intrigued by such modern devices." Symington relaxed slightly, but Miss Marple noted the way his gaze lingered on the typewriter, as if assessing its significance. As they left the office, Miss Marple paused to admire a flower bed outside, her real purpose to observe the window nearest the typewriter. It was unlatched, easily accessible from the street after hours, and she filed the detail away, her mind turning over the implications. A typewriter in an office was no proof of guilt, but its accessibility suggested possibilities, and Symington's guarded demeanor only deepened her suspicions. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen typewriter had been the key to unmasking a forger, and she wondered if Limstock's poison pen letters followed a similar pattern. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple found Joanna Burton waiting, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light as she lounged in the parlor with a cup of tea. Joanna, ever observant, had become a valuable ally, her sharp wit cutting through the village's fog of gossip. "I've been talking to Elsie Holland," she said, her green eyes sparkling with intrigue. "She's rattled, Miss Marple, though she tries to hide it. Says Richard's been working late every night since Mona's death, and he's taken to locking himself in his study. And here's the interesting bit. She mentioned he's been spending a lot of time with her, discussing the boy's future. Sounds fishy to me." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her expression bland but her mind alert. "Indeed," she said softly. "Miss Holland's position in the household is delicate, is it not?" Joanna nodded, leaning forward. "Exactly. She's more than a governess, if you ask me. Mona was barely cold before Richard started leaning on her. And those boys, they're scared of him, you know. I saw them in the garden yesterday, and Colin flinched when Richard called his name." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Joanna's observations, though tinged with her characteristic flippancy, were gold dust, confirming the tensions she had sensed in the Symington household. That evening, as the vicarage settled into a quiet hush, Miss Marple joined Mary and the Reverend for supper, the mood somber despite the comforting aroma of shepherd's pie. The conversation turned to Agnes's murder, and Mary, her eyes shadowed, shared a troubling detail. "I remembered something today," she said, her fork poised over her plate. "Agnes came to me a few days before Mona died, asking if she could speak privately. She seemed frightened, said she'd overheard something in the Symington house that worried her, but she wouldn't say what. I told her to go to the police, but she was too scared." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the revelation. Agnes, it seemed, had been a witness to more than she could bear. After supper, Miss Marple took a turn around the vicarage garden, the cool air sharpening her senses. The village lay still under a canopy of stars, its beauty marred by the invisible poison of the letters. She thought of the typewriter in Symington's office, its accessibility a convenient excuse for its use in the letters, and the shed in his garden, locked and unremarked. Agnes's death, staged as a random attack, was no such thing, she was certain. The letter in her hand, accusing her of eavesdropping, was a clumsy attempt to tie her murder to the broader campaign, but it only deepened Miss Marple's conviction that the killer was someone close to the Symingtons. She resolved to speak with Inspector Graves again, to press for a closer examination of the typewriter and the shed. She also planned to enlist Joanna's aid further, her cottage's view of the Symington garden offering a chance to observe any late-night activity. The threads of the mystery were tightening, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to follow them to their source. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a seemingly trivial clue, a misplaced hairpin, had unraveled a murder. Limstock's secrets, she suspected, were hidden in similar details. The typewriter's worn keys, the shed's heavy lock, the fear in the Symington boy's eyes. As she re-entered the vicarage, Miss Marple paused at the hall table where the parish typewriter sat, its keys gleaming in the lamplight. She ran her fingers lightly over them, noting their crisp typeface, distinct from the letters' uneven capitals. The machine was a red herring, she decided, but Symington's was not. Tomorrow she would find a way to confirm its role, perhaps by asking Joanna to borrow a typed document from his office under some pretext. The truth, she knew, lay in the minutiae, and Miss Marple was adept at finding them, her gentle manner a shield for her relentless curiosity. The clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the quiet vicarage. Miss Marple climbed the stairs to her room, her knitting bag in hand, her mind alive with possibilities. Limstock, with its picturesque charm and hidden malice, was a puzzle she would not abandon. The poison pen letters were a smokescreen, Agnes's death a desperate act to silence a witness, and Mona's suicide a lie. With a final glance at the darkened village, Miss Marple closed her curtains, her thoughts already shaping the next steps in her quiet, unyielding pursuit of justice. Chapter 8. A Trap is Set. The autumn dusk draped Limstock in a veil of shadow, the village's quaint cottages and winding lanes taking on a somber hue as the day faded. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the vicarage's parlor window, worked on her knitting with a steady hand, her pale blue eyes scanning the darkening street. The poison pen letters, relentless in their venom, had tightened their grip on the village, and the murders of Mona Symington and Agnes Waddle had cast a pall over its once tranquil heart. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as her needles, was convinced that the letters were a smokescreen, concealing a calculated crime, and that Richard Symington, with his guarded demeanor and accessible typewriter, was at the center of it. Mary Clement, bustling in with a tray of tea and shortbread, wore a look of weary defiance, her auburn hair escaping its pins. "Jane, you'll strain your eyes in this light," she said, setting the tray on the table. "The village is in an uproar. Another letter arrived at the Danes today, accusing Dr. Dane of overcharging his patients. It's tearing us apart." The Reverend hunched over a sermon draft, sighed heavily. "I fear for our community," he said, his voice low. "The trust we once had is gone, replaced by suspicion." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. The letters, she knew, were a tool, their accusations a distraction from a deeper truth. The arrival of Inspector Graves, his clipped mustache bristling with purpose, broke the parlor's quiet. He accepted a cup of tea, his notebook open on his knee. "We've confirmed the typewriter in Symington's office matches the letters," he said, his tone brisk. "But he claims it's used by his clerk and clients alike, so it proves nothing. As for the shed, we've had no cause to search it yet, locked tight, and Symington says it's just gardening tools." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle but firm. "A lock, Inspector, can protect more than tools, and Agnes Waddle's death suggests someone was desperate to keep something hidden. Perhaps a rumor might flush out the truth." Graves raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "A rumor?" he asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, a well-placed word once unraveled a mystery. Suppose it were known that Agnes confided in someone, say, an old lady like me, about something she saw the night Mona died. The guilty party might act, revealing themselves. Graves hesitated, then nodded, jotting down the idea. "Worth a try," he said gruffly. "But we'll need to be careful. This killer's already struck twice." Miss Marple's plan took shape that afternoon at Mrs. Price's tea party, a gathering of Limstock's matrons in the Manor's grand drawing room, its walls adorned with ancestral portraits. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and the hum of anxious chatter, the poison pen letters and Agnes's murder dominating the conversation. Mrs. Price, her back ramrod straight, presided over the tea tray, her voice sharp as she declared, "This village will not be cowed by a coward hiding behind a typewriter. We must find them." Mrs. Dane, her face pale, nodded, while Miss Ginch, her lips pursed, muttered about divine retribution. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, waited for the right moment. As the conversation lulled, she spoke, her voice soft but carrying. "It's such a tragedy about poor Agnes," she said, her eyes fixed on her needles. "I spoke with her not long before she died, you know. She was terribly frightened, said she'd seen something odd the night Mrs. Symington passed, something near the house. I urged her to tell the police, but she was too scared." The room fell silent, the women's eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Price leaned forward, her teacup forgotten. "What did she see, Miss Marple?" she demanded. Miss Marple shook her head, her expression troubled. "She wouldn't say, poor child, but I've told Inspector Graves, and he's looking into it." The seed was planted, and Miss Marple watched as the news spread, the women's whispers carrying her words like wildfire. Richard Symington, present with Elsie Holland, stiffened visibly, his hand tightening on his saucer. Elsie's face paled, her eyes darting to Richard, and Miss Marple noted the exchange, her needles clicking rhythmically. The trap was set, and she hoped it would provoke a reaction, a slip that would reveal the killer's hand. As the tea party dispersed, Joanna Burton, who had been listening intently, sidled up to Miss Marple. "That was clever," she murmured, her green eyes sparkling. "You're baiting someone, aren't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes, Miss Burton, a little nudge is all it takes to bring the truth to light." That evening, Miss Marple enlisted Joanna's aid, her cottage's view of the Symington garden offering a perfect vantage point. "Would you keep watch tonight?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes serious. "Particularly on the shed. If someone moves, it might confirm my suspicions." Joanna, thrilled by the prospect of intrigue, agreed readily, promising to report any activity. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, her mind turning over the day's events. The typewriter, confirmed as the source of the letters, pointed to Symington's office, but his claim of shared access was a convenient shield. The shed, locked and unexamined, was a nagging detail, its contents potentially the key to the murders. At supper, the vicarage was quiet, the weight of Agnes's death and the ongoing letters pressing on Mary and the Reverend. "I saw Elsie Holland in the village today," Mary said, her voice low. "She looked like a ghost, Jane. And Richard, he's barely left his office since Agnes died. It's as if he's hiding." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the shed and its heavy lock. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a locked cupboard had concealed evidence of a crime, its contents revealed only when the culprit panicked. If her rumor worked, Symington, or someone close to him, might act, betraying their guilt. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the village shrouded in darkness. The trap she had set was a risk, but a calculated one, designed to provoke without endangering others. She thought of Agnes, her fear and her untimely silence, and of Mona, whose death had been too neatly staged. The letters, she was certain, were a diversion, their accusations a mask for a motive rooted in the Symington household. Richard's wealth, tied to Mona's inheritance, was a possibility, as was his relationship with Elsie, whose devotion seemed more than professional. The boys, too, were a factor, their fear of their father a clue to his true nature. Around midnight, Joanna arrived at the vicarage, her face flushed with excitement. "I saw something," she whispered, drawing Miss Marple to the parlor. Richard Symington went to the shed just after 11. He was carrying a lantern, and he came out with a small bottle. Glass, I think. He looked nervous, kept checking over his shoulder. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her theory taking shape. "Well done, Miss Burton," she said softly. "That bottle may be the key. We must inform Inspector Graves at once." Joanna nodded, her enthusiasm tempered by a shiver of unease. "Do you think he's the one, Miss Marple?" "The killer?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I think, my dear, that we are very close to finding out." The next morning, Miss Marple accompanied Joanna to the police station, where Inspector Graves listened to their account with growing interest. "A bottle, you say?" he asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "Could be cyanide, if it's tied to Mrs. Symington's death. I'll get a warrant to search that shed." Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland but her mind alive with possibilities. The shed, she suspected, held the evidence that would tie the letters to the murders, and Symington's late-night visit was a sign of his panic. Her rumor had worked, stirring the waters, and now the truth was rising to the surface. As they left the station, Miss Marple paused to adjust her shawl, her eyes scanning the high street. The village, with its picturesque charm, was a facade, its secrets hidden in plain sight. She thought of the typewriter, its keys worn from use, and the shed, its lock a barrier to the truth. Symington's reaction at the tea party, his glance at Elsie, and now his nocturnal errand, all pointed to a man with something to hide. But the motive, greed, passion, or something else, remained elusive, and Miss Marple knew she needed more than suspicion to unmask him. Back at the vicarage, she sat with Mary and the Reverend, the conversation subdued as they discussed the latest developments. "Inspector Graves is a good man," the Reverend said, his voice hopeful. "He'll get to the bottom of this." Mary nodded, but her eyes were troubled. "I just want it to end, Jane. The letters, the deaths. It's too much." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but reassuring. "It will end, my dear," she said softly. "The truth has a way of coming out, even in a place like Limstock." As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple took a turn around the vicarage garden, the cool air sharpening her senses. The village lay quiet under a blanket of stars, its beauty marred by the shadow of murder. She thought of Agnes's fear, Mona's staged suicide, and the letter's relentless campaign. The trap she had set was closing, and Symington, she suspected, was feeling its pressure. With Joanna's vigilance and Graves's investigation, the pieces were falling into place, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was ready to see the puzzle completed. The clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the vicarage, and she returned inside, her knitting bag in hand, her mind already plotting the final moves in her pursuit of justice. Chapter 9. The motive uncovered. The late September mist clung to Limstock's cobblestone lanes, softening the outlines of its thatched cottages and lending an air of secrecy to the village's quiet streets. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's parlor with her knitting, gazed out at the shrouded landscape, her pale blue eyes sharp with purpose. The poison pen letters, relentless in their spread, had fractured the village's fragile harmony, and the murders of Mona Symington and Agnes Waddle had deepened its wounds. Miss Marple, her mind as precise as her needles, was convinced that Richard Symington was the key, his typewriter and late-night visit to the garden shed betraying a calculated plan. The trap she had set at Mrs. Price's tea party, with its rumor of Agnes's revelation, had stirred the waters, and now she awaited the ripples. Mary Clement, bustling in with a tray of tea and scones, wore a look of weary resolve, her auburn hair pinned haphazardly. "Jane, you're up early," she said, setting the tray on the table. "The village is buzzing about Agnes's murder. Mrs. Baker says Inspector Graves is questioning everyone at the Symington house again. I hope he finds something soon." The Reverend, polishing his spectacles, nodded somberly. "The parish is in turmoil," he said. "I saw Mrs. Dane whispering with Miss Ginch in the churchyard yesterday, and Mr. Pye won't even look at me. These letters have poisoned us all." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. The letters, she knew, were a distraction, their venom masking a motive rooted in the Symington household. Determined to clarify her suspicions, Miss Marple sought out the Reverend Clement after breakfast, finding him in his study amidst a clutter of parish records. "Leonard," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I need your insight into the Symingtons. Mona's death, and now Agnes's, suggests a pattern. What can you tell me about their marriage?" The Reverend hesitated, his kind face troubled. "It wasn't a happy one, Jane," he admitted. "Mona was fragile, always anxious, and Richard was often impatient with her. She inherited a substantial sum from her aunt, you know, which funded their lifestyle. Richard managed it, but I heard whispers he resented her control over it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. Money, she knew, was a powerful motive, and Richard's control of Mona's wealth suggested a thread worth pulling. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the vicarage door. Joanna Burton, her green eyes bright with urgency, swept in, her scarf trailing behind her. "Miss Marple, I've got news," she said, sinking into a chair. "I kept watch on the Symington garden again last night, as you asked. Nothing happened, but I spoke to Elsie Holland this morning. She's a wreck, says Richard's been distant, locking himself in his study every evening. And get this, she let slip that Mona was planning to change her will before she died, to put the boy's inheritance in a trust. Richard was furious, apparently." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "How very interesting," she said softly. "A trust would have limited his access, I presume?" Joanna nodded, her expression triumphant. "Exactly. Elsie clammed up after that, but I could tell she was nervous." The revelation sharpened Miss Marple's focus. Mona's wealth, controlled by Richard but potentially slipping from his grasp, was a motive for murder, and Agnes's death suggested she had overheard or seen something incriminating. The poison pen letters, typed on Symington's imperial machine, were a brilliant distraction, sowing chaos to mask his actions. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a husband's greed had led to a staged suicide, the truth uncovered only when a maid's testimony revealed his late-night movements. Agnes, she suspected, had been silenced for similar reasons, her murder a desperate act to protect a killer's secret. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple proposed a visit to the village tea room, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea. Mary, eager for distraction, agreed, and they set off down the high street, the mist parting to reveal Limstock's quaint charm. The tea room, run by the bustling Mrs. Tuttle, was crowded with villagers, their voices a low hum of speculation. Mrs. Price, presiding over a corner table, was in full cry, her voice sharp as she declared, "This village is cursed. First Mona, now Agnes, and those letters keep coming. I say it's someone with a personal grudge against the Symingtons." Mrs. Dane, pale and withdrawn, nodded faintly, while Miss Ginch, her lips pursed, muttered about divine justice. Miss Marple, seated with a cup of Earl Grey, listened intently, her knitting bag at her side. The rumor she had planted at the tea party had spread, and she noted the way eyes darted toward the door whenever someone entered, as if expecting a revelation. Mrs. Tuttle, pouring tea, leaned close and whispered, "I heard from the milkman that Agnes was scared before she died. Said she'd seen something in the Symington house, but wouldn't tell anyone what." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the confirmation. Agnes's fear, coupled with Joanna's report of the shed, pointed to a secret Richard was desperate to conceal. As they left the tea room, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward Elsie Holland, probing Mary for details about the governess's role in the Symington household. "She's devoted to those boys," Mary said, her tone grudging. "But she's too close to Richard, if you ask me. Mona used to complain about it, said Elsie was always underfoot, acting like the lady of the house." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the glance she had observed between Richard and Elsie at the dinner party. An affair, though unproven, could complicate the motive, intertwining passion with greed. The boys, too, were a factor, their subdued behavior suggesting they lived in fear of their father's temper. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Joanna's cottage, its windows offering a clear view of the Symington garden. Joanna, brewing tea in her cramped kitchen, was eager to share more gossip. "I've been watching the shed, as you suggested," she said, her eyes bright. "Nothing since that night with the bottle, but I did see Richard arguing with Elsie in the garden yesterday." She looked upset, kept shaking her head. I couldn't hear much, but I caught the word money. Sounded serious. Miss Marple's smile was faint but encouraging. "You've been most helpful, Miss Burton," she said. "Would you be willing to do one more thing? Perhaps borrow a typed document from Mr. Symington's office, something routine, to compare with the letters." Joanna's eyebrows lifted, but she nodded, intrigued by the challenge. "I can say I need a copy of a lease or something. He's got no reason to suspect me." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Discretion, my dear, is key. We mustn't tip our hand." The plan, though simple, was a step toward confirming the typewriter's role, and Miss Marple hoped it would yield a sample to match the letter's distinctive typeface. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple confided her theory to the Reverend, choosing her words with care to avoid alarming him. "I believe, Leonard," she said, her voice soft, "that Mona's death was no suicide, but a murder, and Agnes was killed because she knew too much. The letters are a distraction, typed by someone with access to Mr. Symington's machine, perhaps to create chaos and divert suspicion." The Reverend's face paled, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Richard Symington?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression non-committal. "It's possible," she said, "but we need evidence, not supposition. The shed may hold the key, perhaps the cyanide used to kill Mona. The Reverend nodded, his faith in Miss Marple's judgment outweighing his shock. "I'll speak to Inspector Graves," he said. "He respects you, Jane, even if he doesn't always show it." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. The trap she had set was working, Richard's late-night visit to the shed a sign of his unease, but she needed concrete proof to tie him to the murders. The typewriter, the shed, and Agnes's fear were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. That evening, as the vicarage settled into a quiet hush, Miss Marple took a turn around the garden, the cool air sharpening her senses. The village lay still under a canopy of stars, its beauty marred by the shadow of murder. She thought of Mona's wealth, controlled by Richard but threatened by her plan to change her will, and of Elsie, whose devotion to the solicitor hinted at more than professional loyalty. The boys, with their frightened glances, were witnesses to a household under strain, and Agnes's murder suggested she had stumbled on a truth too dangerous to keep. As she re-entered the vicarage, Miss Marple paused at the hall table where the parish typewriter sat, its keys gleaming in the lamplight. She ran her fingers over them, confirming their typeface was distinct from the letters, uneven capitals. Symington's machine, she was certain, was the one used, its accessibility a convenient excuse for his involvement. Tomorrow, she would press Graves to search the shed, and Joanna's borrowed document might provide the final link. The motive, greed, perhaps fueled by an affair, was clear, but the proof lay in the details, and Miss Marple was adept at finding them. The clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the vicarage, and Miss Marple climbed the stairs to her room, her knitting bag in hand. Limstock, with its picturesque charm and hidden malice, was a puzzle nearing its solution. The poison pen letters were a smokescreen, Mona's death a murder, and Agnes's a desperate act to silence a witness. With Joanna's vigilance and Graves's investigation, the truth was within reach, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was ready to seize it. She closed her curtains, her mind already shaping the final moves in her pursuit of justice. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The autumn rain fell in a steady drizzle over Limstock, cloaking the village in a somber gray that mirrored its mood of unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's parlor with her knitting, gazed out at the sodden lanes, her pale blue eyes as sharp as ever behind her spectacles. The poison pen letters, with their typed venom, had fractured the village's fragile harmony, and the murders of Mona Symington and Agnes Waddle had deepened its wounds. Miss Marple's trap, set with a carefully planted rumor at Mrs. Price's tea party, had borne fruit. Richard Symington's late-night visit to his garden shed, witnessed by Joanna Burton, suggested a man desperate to conceal evidence. Now, with Inspector Graves's search imminent, Miss Marple sensed the net was closing around the solicitor. Mary Clement, bustling in with a tray of tea and crumpets, wore a look of weary determination, her auburn hair damp from a dash through the rain. "Jane, you'll catch your death staring out into this weather," she said, setting the tray on the table. "The village is in a state. Mrs. Tuttle says another letter arrived at the baker's, accusing him of using spoiled flour. It's as if the devil himself is at work." The Reverend, adjusting his spectacles, nodded grimly. "I fear for our flock," he said. "The poison of these letters has tainted us all." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression serene, but her mind alive with connections. The letters, she was certain, were a distraction, their accusations a veil for Richard Symington's crimes. The morning brought a visit from Inspector Graves, his clipped mustache damp with rain, and his notebook clutched tightly. "We've searched Symington's shed," he announced, accepting a cup of tea from Mary. "Found a vial of cyanide hidden in a tin of weed killer. Matches the type used in Mrs. Symington's death. We're bringing him in for questioning." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle but incisive. "A significant find, Inspector. And the typewriter? Did the document Miss Burton borrowed confirm its use in the letters?" Graves nodded, his skepticism replaced by grudging respect. "It's a match. The Imperial in his office typed every letter we've collected. He's got some explaining to do." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Her trap, spreading the rumor that Agnes had confided in her about a suspicious sighting, had provoked Symington's nocturnal errand, and Joanna's vigilance had provided the crucial lead. The cyanide, concealed in the shed, tied him to Mona's murder, while the typewriter linked him to the letters. The motive, she suspected, lay in Mona's wealth, controlled by Richard, but threatened by her plan to place it in a trust for her sons. Agnes's murder, she believed, was a desperate act to silence a witness who had overheard or seen something incriminating. But suspicion was not proof, and Miss Marple knew the confrontation would require precision to secure a confession. Determined to observe the interrogation, Miss Marple requested to accompany Graves to the police station, citing her role in the rumor that had spurred the search. Graves, though initially reluctant, agreed, sensing her insight might prove valuable. The station, a squat brick building at the edge of the village, was a hive of activity, its officers bustling with the weight of a double murder case. Richard Symington sat in a small, bare room, his tailored suit slightly rumpled, his face a mask of controlled composure. Elsie Holland, summoned as a witness, stood outside, her blonde hair pulled back tightly, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner, noted the governess's pallor and the way her eyes darted toward the interrogation room. Graves began with the typewriter, laying out the evidence with methodical precision. "The letters, Mr. Symington, were typed on your imperial machine," he said, his voice firm. "Every one of them, from the first sent to the vicarage to the one found with Agnes Waddle. Care to explain?" Symington's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "As I told you, Inspector, my office is open to clients and staff. Anyone could have used it after hours. The window's unlatched, you know that." Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, observed the slight tremor in his hands, a crack in his polished facade. Graves pressed on, producing the vial of cyanide. "This was found in your shed, hidden in a tin of weed killer, the same type used to kill your wife. Only you have the key to that lock, Mr. Symington. How did it get there?" Symington's eyes flickered, but he maintained his composure. "I've no idea," he said. "I keep gardening supplies there, nothing else. Someone must have planted it." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his forehead, a sign of strain beneath his calm exterior. Miss Marple, with Graves's permission, interjected, her voice soft but piercing. "Mr. Symington, you must have been terribly distressed by Mona's death," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "And Agnes's so soon after. I understand Mona was planning to change her will, to place her inheritance in a trust for your sons. That must have been inconvenient." Symington's face paled, his hands clenching the edge of the table. "What are you implying?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "Only that money can be a powerful motive, Mr. Symington. And Agnes, poor girl, may have overheard something that night, perhaps in your study, where the typewriter sits." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Elsie, visible through the open door, gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Graves seized the moment, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We know Agnes was frightened, Mr. Symington. She told Mrs. Clement she'd seen something odd the night your wife died. And Miss Burton saw you in the shed, retrieving a bottle. You were checking to see if it was still hidden, weren't you?" Symington's composure cracked, his shoulders slumping as he buried his face in his hands. "It's not what you think," he muttered, his voice muffled. "I didn't mean for any of this." Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone as gentle as a grandmother's, but relentless in its clarity. "You planned it meticulously, Mr. Symington," she said. "The letters were your creation, typed on your machine to sow chaos and divert suspicion from Mona's murder. You slipped cyanide into her tea, knowing her nervous disposition would make suicide plausible. But Agnes overheard you, didn't she? Perhaps a conversation with Elsie, or a glimpse of the cyanide in your study. She had to be silenced, so you struck her down and left another letter to tie her death to the campaign." Symington's head snapped up, his eyes wild. "You can't prove that," he said, but his voice trembled, betraying his fear. Graves produced a typed document, borrowed by Joanna from Symington's office, its typeface matching the letters exactly. "This seals it," he said, "and the shed's lock. Only you had the key. You hid the cyanide there, thinking it safe, but Miss Marple's rumor flushed you out." Symington's face crumpled, his hands shaking as he gripped the table. "I didn't want to hurt Agnes," he whispered. "She saw me with the bottle that night, asked what it was. I panicked. Mona was draining me, always fussing, threatening to lock away her money. I couldn't let her ruin everything." The confession spilled out, halting at first, then in a torrent. Symington admitted to typing the letters, using them to create a village-wide scandal that would mask Mona's murder. He had poisoned her tea, staging the scene with a letter accusing her of infidelity to ensure a suicide verdict. Agnes, overhearing his plans, became a liability, her murder a desperate act to protect his secret. Elsie, he insisted, knew nothing, though Miss Marple noted the governess's tear-streaked face outside, suggesting she suspected more than she admitted. As Symington was led away, his wrists cuffed, Miss Marple sat back, her knitting untouched. The confrontation had been swift, the truth laid bare by the weight of evidence and her carefully laid trap. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where a similar case had hinged on a single overlooked detail, a misplaced key that unlocked a killer's guilt. In Limstock, it was the shed's lock and the typewriter's typeface, small clues that had unraveled a murderer's scheme. Back at the vicarage, the news of Symington's arrest spread like wildfire, carried by Mrs. Baker's breathless account to the village. Mary, pouring tea, was near tears with relief. "It's over, Jane," she said, her voice trembling. "You've saved us all." The Reverend nodded, his face alight with gratitude. "Your wisdom, Miss Marple, is a gift. I don't know how we'd have managed without you." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythmic dance. "People often underestimate the obvious," she said softly. "But the truth has a way of surfacing, even in a village like Limstock." That evening, Miss Marple took a turn around the vicarage garden, the rain having cleared to reveal a sky studded with stars. The village, though scarred, would heal, its trust slowly rebuilt. She thought of Mona, whose wealth had been her undoing, and Agnes, whose loyalty had cost her life. The letters, a cruel distraction, had served their purpose, but Symington's arrogance had been his downfall. Elsie, she suspected, would leave Limstock, her role in the household too tainted by association. The boys, Colin and Brian, would need care, perhaps from a kindly aunt, to mend their broken spirits. As she re-entered the vicarage, Miss Marple paused at the hall table, where the parish typewriter sat, its keys gleaming in the lamplight. It was innocent, unlike Symington's, but it reminded her of the power of small details. The confrontation had been a triumph of observation and patience, her trap exposing a killer who thought himself untouchable. The clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the quiet vicarage, and Miss Marple climbed the stairs, her knitting bag in hand. Limstock's secrets were laid bare, and she was ready to return to St. Mary Mead, where other puzzles, no doubt, awaited her quiet, relentless pursuit of justice. Chapter 11. The Village Heals. The autumn sun broke through the clouds over Limstock, casting a tentative warmth across the village's cobblestone lanes and thatched cottages. The rain-soaked streets glistened, reflecting a fragile hope that seemed to rise with the clearing skies. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's parlor with her knitting, gazed out at the high street, where villagers moved with a cautious return to routine. The arrest of Richard Symington, exposed as the author of the poison pen letters, and the murderer of his wife, Mona, and their maid, Agnes Waddle, had lifted a shadow from Limstock, though its scars remained. Miss Marple, her pale blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles, felt the weight of resolution, her quiet persistence having unraveled a web of deceit. Mary Clement, bustling in with a tray of tea and freshly baked scones, wore a brighter expression than in days past, though her auburn hair still escaped its pins in a familiar tangle. "Jane, it's like a weight's been lifted," she said, setting the tray on the table. With a gentle clink, "The village is talking of nothing but Symington's arrest. Mrs. Baker says no new letters have arrived since yesterday. Dare we hope it's over?" The Reverend, polishing his spectacles at the desk, looked up with a rare smile. "Your wisdom has been a blessing, Miss Marple," he said. "The parish owes you a debt we can scarcely repay." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression serene, but her mind alert, reflecting on the delicate process of mending a fractured community. The village, though relieved, was not yet whole. The poison pen letters, with their cruel accusations, had sown distrust among neighbors, and the murders had left a lingering unease. Miss Marple, preparing to return to St. Mary Mead, knew that healing would take time, but the absence of new letters was a promising sign. She suggested a walk to the village shop, eager to gauge Limstock's mood firsthand. Mary, grateful for the distraction, agreed, and they set off down the lane, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and late roses. The high street was busier than it had been in weeks, with villagers exchanging cautious greetings, their smiles tentative but genuine. At the shop, Mr. Pye, the grocer, was restocking shelves, his usual theatricality subdued by recent events. Miss Marple, Mrs. Clement, he said, adjusting his spectacles. The village is breathing easier, thanks to you. No more of those wretched letters, and Symington behind bars. It's a miracle. His voice held a note of relief, but Miss Marple noted the way. His eyes darted to the door, as if expecting another typed missive to appear. Mrs. Baker, the postmistress, joined the conversation, her face flushed with excitement. I've sorted the mail this morning, and not a single letter in those awful capitals, she said, her hands busy with a stack of envelopes. Inspector Graves says Symington confessed to everything, typing the letters, poisoning Mona, even killing poor Agnes. All to keep his wife's money. Can you believe it? Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland, but her thoughts on the motive she had pieced together. Mona's wealth, threatened by her plan to place it in a trust, and Symington's desperation to maintain control, perhaps fueled by his attachment to Elsie Holland. As they left the shop, Miss Marple paused to admire a display of chrysanthemums, her real purpose to observe the villagers passing by. Mrs. Dane, the doctor's wife, walked arm in arm with Miss Ginch, their heads bent in quiet conversation, a sign of reconciliation after weeks of suspicion. The baker, Mr. Cuttle, waved cheerfully from his shop, his earlier fears of spoiled flour forgotten. Even Mrs. Price, striding toward the church with her usual authority, paused to nod at Miss Marple, a rare gesture of respect. The village, though scarred, was knitting itself back together, its trust slowly mending like one of Miss Marple's careful stitches. At the tea-room, Mrs. Tuttle greeted them with a tray of her finest cakes, her face alight with gratitude. "Miss Marple, you're a marvel," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "I told everyone you'd get to the bottom of it. Symington fooled us all, but not you." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking as she settled into a chair. "People often overlook the obvious," she said softly. "But the truth has a way of surfacing, even in a place like Limstock." The tea-room was crowded, its air filled with the hum of conversation, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the furtive glances that had marked earlier gatherings. The poison of the letters was fading, replaced by a cautious optimism. Joanna Burton joined them, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she slipped into a seat, her green eyes sparkling with her usual vivacity. "Miss Marple, you're the talk of the village," she said, helping herself to a cake. "I heard from Mrs. Baker that Symington's confession was all thanks to your rumor about Agnes. Clever trick, planting that story at the tea party." Miss Marple's smile was faint but warm. "Sometimes, my dear, a little nudge is all it takes to bring the truth to light." Joanna laughed, then lowered her voice. "Elsie Holland's leaving, you know, says she can't stay after all this. And the boys, Colin and Brian, are going to their aunt in London. Poor things, they'll need time to heal." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the Symington boys, whose frightened glances had hinted at their father's true nature. Elsie's departure was no surprise. Her closeness to Richard, though not criminal, had tainted her role in the household. The boys, she hoped, would find solace with their aunt, away from the shadow of their father's crimes. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a family's secrets had been exposed by a child's innocent remark, and she wondered if Colin or Brian might one day reveal more about their father's actions, though the case was now closed. The conversation turned to the village's recovery, and Mrs. Tuttle shared news of a planned gathering at the church, a sort of communal cleansing to mark the end of the letters. "Mrs. Price is organizing it," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. "Says it's time we came together as a community. Even Mr. Pies agreed to help, though he's still grumbling about his reputation." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind reflecting on the power of community to heal. Limstock, like St. Mary Mead, was resilient, its people capable of rebuilding trust once the poison was purged. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple prepared for her departure, her small suitcase packed with the neat efficiency of a seasoned traveler. Mary, helping her fold a shawl, was near tears. "Jane, you've been our savior," she said, her voice trembling. "Without you, we'd still be living in fear, suspecting each other. How can we thank you?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but reassuring. "You've thanked me with your hospitality, my dear," she said, "and Limstock will thank you by coming together again. Villages are strong, you know, stronger than their secrets." The Reverend, joining them in the parlor, echoed her sentiments. "Your insight, Miss Marple, is a gift from above," he said, his kind face alight with gratitude. "I've prepared a sermon for Sunday about forgiveness and renewal, inspired by your example." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking as she finished a row. "You're very kind, Leonard," she said, "but I only saw what was there to see. People's natures don't change, but they do reveal themselves given time." That evening, the vicarage hosted a small farewell gathering, with Joanna Burton, Mrs. Price, and Dr. Dane among the guests. The mood was lighter than it had been in weeks, the absence of new letters and Symington's arrest lifting the village's spirits. Joanna, now engaged to Dr. Dane, a development that surprised no one but delighted all, raised a glass to Miss Marple. "To the sharpest mind in Limstock," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You saw through Symington when we were all fooled." Miss Marple, sipping her sherry, demurred. "People often underestimate an old lady's curiosity," she said softly, her smile hiding the steel beneath. Mrs. Price, her usual severity softened, added her own tribute. "You've given us back our village, Miss Marple," she said. "We'll not forget it." Dr. Dane, his arm around Joanna, nodded. "The boys will be cared for," he said. "Their aunt is a good woman, and Limstock will rally round them. We're stronger for this, thanks to you." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her thoughts on the resilience of small communities, their ability to mend even after the deepest wounds. As the guests departed, Miss Marple took a final turn around the vicarage garden, the night air cool and fragrant with the scent of late blooms. The village lay quiet under a canopy of stars, its beauty restored by the truth's emergence. She thought of Mona, whose wealth had been her undoing, and Agnes, whose loyalty had cost her life. The letters, a cruel distraction, had served Symington's purpose until his own panic betrayed him. The shed, the typewriter, the rumor she had planted, they were the threads that had unraveled his scheme, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, had woven them into justice. Back inside, she paused at the hall table where the parish typewriter sat, its keys gleaming in the lamplight. It was innocent, unlike Symington's, but it reminded her of the power of small details. The village's healing, she knew, would be slow but steady, its people finding strength in shared purpose. The clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the vicarage, and Miss Marple climbed the stairs to her room, her knitting bag in hand. Limstock was on the mend, and she was ready to return to St. Mary Mead, where other secrets no doubt awaited her keen observation. With a final glance at the starlit village, she closed her curtains, her mind at peace with a case well solved. Chapter 12. Reflections on Evil. The train from Limstock to London chugged through the Devon countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing counterpoint to the patchwork of fields and hedgerows slipping past the window. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a quiet compartment with her small suitcase and knitting bag, gazed out at the rolling hills, her pale blue eyes thoughtful behind her spectacles. The village of Limstock, with its picturesque charm and hidden darkness, was fading into memory, its wounds beginning to heal after the unmasking of Richard Symington as the author of the poison pen letters and the murderer of his wife, Mona, and their maid, Agnes Waddle. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as her needles, reflected on the case, her quiet persistence having brought light to a shadowed corner of human nature. The vicarage had been a hive of gratitude that morning, with Mary Clement pressing a basket of homemade preserves into Miss Marple's hands as she prepared to depart. "Jane, you've saved us," Mary had said, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Limstock will never forget you." The Reverend, his spectacles polished to a gleam, had clasped her hand warmly. "Your wisdom is a gift, Miss Marple," he had said. "You've shown us that truth prevails, even in the darkest times." Miss Marple had smiled, her expression serene, but her thoughts had already turned inward, piecing together the lessons of the case as she boarded the train. The compartment was nearly empty, save for a young mother coaxing a toddler to nap and an elderly gentleman engrossed in a newspaper. Miss Marple's knitting lay in her lap, a soft tangle of pale blue wool, but her needles were still as she considered the intricacies of Limstock's tragedy. The poison pen letters, typed on Symington's imperial machine, had been a masterstroke of misdirection, their venomous accusations sowing discord to mask his murder of Mona. The cyanide, hidden in the shed, had ended her life, staged as a suicide to deflect suspicion. Agnes, poor child, had paid the ultimate price for her unwitting knowledge, her murder a desperate act to silence a witness. Miss Marple's rumor, planted at Mrs. Price's tea party, had provoked Symington's fatal mistake, his late-night errand to the shed revealing the evidence that sealed his guilt. She thought of the village's reaction, the slow mending of its fractured trust. The absence of new letters had brought a cautious relief, and the gathering planned at the church, as Mrs. Tuttle had described, promised to knit the community back together. Miss Marple recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a series of anonymous notes had concealed a theft, the culprit unmasked by a single misplaced letter. In Limstock, the stakes had been higher, the crimes bloodier, but the principle was the same. Human nature, with its capacity for greed and deceit, was predictable, yet endlessly inventive in its execution. The train's whistle sounded, pulling Miss Marple from her reverie. She opened her knitting bag, her fingers finding the familiar comfort of her needles, and began to work, the soft click a steady rhythm against the train's sway. Symington's motive, she mused, was rooted in money. Mona's inheritance, controlled by him but threatened by her plan to secure it for their sons, Colin and Brian. His relationship with Elsie Holland, though not the primary driver, had added a layer of complexity, her devotion to him perhaps blinding her to his darker actions. Miss Marple wondered, as she knitted, whether Elsie had suspected more than she admitted, her tearful presence at the police station a sign of guilt or fear. The boys, she thought, were the true victims. their frightened glances a testament to a household ruled by tension. Their aunt in London, as Joanna had reported, would provide the care they needed, a chance to heal away from Limstock's tainted memories. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered their future, her heart softening for the children caught in their father's web. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young girl's testimony had revealed a family's secrets, and she hoped Colin and Brian would find peace, their voices perhaps one day adding to the story of their father's downfall. The train slowed as it approached a small station, the platform bustling with passengers. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the newspaper in the elderly gentleman's hands, its headline proclaiming a local scandal resolved. She smiled faintly, her thoughts returning to Limstock's recovery. Joanna Burton, now engaged to Dr. Dane, had been a bright spark in the case, her sharp observations and willingness to watch the Symington garden proving invaluable. Her cottage, with its view of the shed, had been the key to catching Symington's nocturnal errand, and Miss Marple felt a quiet pride in the young woman's courage. Joanna's engagement, a happy footnote to the tragedy, was a reminder that life, even in the wake of evil, found a way to renew itself. The village's matrons, Mrs. Price, Mrs. Dane, Miss Ginch, had played their parts, their gossip and suspicions a mirror to Limstock's fractured state. Mrs. Price's tea party, where Miss Marple had planted her rumor, had been the turning point, the moment the killer's panic began to unravel his careful plan. Mrs. Dane, once accused of infidelity, had regained her composure, her friendship with Miss Ginch a sign of the village's mending bonds. Even Mr. Pye, the theatrical grocer, had softened, his grumbling replaced by a grudging respect for the truth's triumph. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her mind weaving these threads into a tapestry of human resilience. She thought of Inspector Graves, his initial skepticism giving way to respect as her insights proved correct. The typewriter, confirmed as the source of the letters, and the cyanide vial, hidden in the shed, had been the physical evidence that supported her theory. Graves's search, prompted by her suggestion, had been the final blow to Symington's facade, his confession a testament to the power of small details. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a misplaced button had led to a murderer's downfall, and she marveled at how often the truth hid in plain sight, waiting for a keen eye to uncover it. The train rattled on, the countryside giving way to the outskirts of London, its chimneys and rooftops a stark contrast to Limstock's pastoral charm. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the nature of evil, a subject she had pondered often in her quiet village life. Symington's actions, calculated, cold, driven by greed, were not unique, but their execution in Limstock had been particularly insidious. The letters, with their typed venom, had exploited the village's trust, turning neighbors into suspects and friends into foes. Yet in their cruelty, they had revealed their maker's hand, his need to control the narrative betraying his guilt. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the letters' role. They were a distraction, yes, but also a reflection of Symington's arrogance, his belief that he could manipulate an entire village without consequence. She thought of Mona, whose nervous disposition had made her an easy target, and Agnes, whose loyalty had cost her life. The shed, with its hidden cyanide, and the typewriter, with its worn keys, were the tools of his deception, but it was his own panic, provoked by her rumor, that had undone him. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. Human nature, she reflected, was both predictable and surprising, its flaws as consistent as its capacity for redemption. The young mother across the compartment stirred, coaxing her toddler with a biscuit, and Miss Marple's thoughts softened. Limstock, like St. Mary Mead, would recover, its people finding strength in shared purpose. The church, gathering planned to restore unity, would be a step toward healing, a chance for the village to reclaim its heart. Mrs. Tuttle's cakes, Mr. Pye's restocked shelves, Mrs. Baker's bustling post office, all would resume their roles in the village's daily life, their rhythm a testament to resilience. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind picturing the high street, its cobblestones gleaming under a new day's sun. As the train neared London, Miss Marple thought of her return to St. Mary Mead, where her own cottage awaited, its garden likely overgrown in her absence. She looked forward to its quiet familiarity, the chance to sit by her own hearth with her knitting and reflect on Limstock's lessons. The case had been a challenge, its layers of deceit requiring patience and precision to unravel. Yet, it was no different from the puzzles she had solved before, each one a study in human nature, each solution a triumph of observation over malice. The elderly gentleman folded his newspaper, glancing at Miss Marple with a polite nod. "Traveling far?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. "Only to St. Mary Mead," she replied, her smile gentle. "A quiet village, much like the one I've left." He chuckled, unaware of the irony. "Sounds peaceful," he said. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It has its moments," she said softly, her thoughts on the secrets that even quiet villages held. The train pulled into the station, its whistle piercing the air. Miss Marple gathered her suitcase and knitting bag, her movements as precise as her deductions. Limstock's case was closed, its killer unmasked, its wounds beginning to heal. She stepped onto the platform, the bustle of London a sharp contrast to the village's stillness, and made her way to the connecting train for St. Mary Mead. As she settled into her new compartment, her knitting resumed, the soft click of her needles a steady rhythm. The moving finger, she thought, had written its tale in Limstock, but it had moved on, leaving her to seek the next puzzle, the next truth, in the quiet corners of her own village.